All right, let's talk about the court system in Texas. And in order to do that, let's kind of go back to the basics of kind of what we're actually studying here. There's three different kinds of courts that exist in the Texas system, or at least in most state systems. Now, in the federal system, you have civil versus criminal. But in the state system, we add another layer to it. So we have civil trials, and we have criminal law, and we have what's called family law. So let's talk about what civil law is first. Civil law is generally when another person is suing somebody else, or a company is suing an individual, or a company suing another company. These are issues that are not crimes that have actually been committed, but some type of loss or something that a company or an individual has accrued that basically uses the court system in order to get regress. Criminal law system, which is basically the idea of, somebody has actually committed a crime against the state. And so it's the state against an actual individual. And this is the one where basically civil is preponderance of the evidence, meaning you just needed a majority in order to get a conviction or a decision. And criminal law is actually, you need everybody. It's unanimous in order to get a decision. Family law is a little bit different, and it's more about judges that actually help decide the disposition of how a family should actually be handled due to all sorts of legal ramifications that may actually come up. Okay, and there's much more detail, which is in the book, but I just want to give you the basics of kind of what we're actually studying here. One second. So with the federal system, we also have the same thing in the state system of the idea of grand juries. So before something actually goes to trial, we tend to put it in front of a grand jury, which then decides whether or not there actually will be a trial. We also have another thing going on in Texas, which is more of a state thing than a federal thing, which is if it doesn't require a grand jury in certain jurisdictions, it doesn't. What they'll do is an administrative hearing. And so instead of a trial in front of, the entire, not a trial, instead of the grand jury meeting and looking at the evidence, decide if there's going to be a trial, it'll actually be a judge determining whether or not there'll be a trial kind of going forward. For juries that we have in the state of Texas, it's usually 12 people, and they call them petty juries, which if you look at the spelling of it, it looks like petite juries. And this basically means citizens that determine guilt or innocence during a trial. Then we have different kinds of trials that actually take place in the state. It kind of works on a kind of a moving up system, whereas we start off at the district courts, which we do in the same thing with the federal system, where you start off at the very beginning with an actual trial, jury trial, and then it leads up to the appellate courts. The jury trial is something that actually requires facts. So you're actually trying to figure out whether or not somebody did something or didn't do something, or whatever the evidence is in a particular situation. Whereas appellate courts actually deal with more issues that have to do with the point of law, not facts. So if there's a constitutional issue or something was done that looks like it didn't actually meet the standards of what should actually happen in a court system, then that's actually considered something you would probably see in an appellate court. And that's what they're actually looking at. Appellate courts don't retry an actual case. They try whether or not the case was actually a validly decided case. Anyway, so let's talk about other kinds of trials that we actually have. We have what's called a magistrate of minor courts. So this would be, we do have judges that actually decide on issues that don't actually require entire juries. And this is usually for like misdemeanors, minor civil cases, things that don't require, the higher level of, like the big kind of district court cases that we're actually talking about. Um, the way we get judges in Texas now, all states kind of decide how they're going to actually put their judges into their positions. The federal system, they're appointed, and it's an entire, it's a lifetime appointment. Basically, it's kind of how it actually works. Texas is one of the few states, or one of the number of states that actually does it by election. So we actually have elections for judges in order to decide who's actually going to serve as an actual judge, and they keep that job with subsequent elections. So they can keep the job because they show that they've been doing a good job all the way through it. The problem with that is every election, if you've looked at a ballot on an election and you see a bunch of judges on there, the majority of the people who are voting have no idea who any of the judges actually are. So that becomes a real problem, because people just kind of like look at the ballot, and then you start to get really weird circumstances as to why someone would actually be approved as a judge. For one, if the name is on there, people will generally just kind of say, okay, fine, and vote for that person. If they're running against somebody, then you kind of run into, problems. And so you have to kind of figure out what would actually cause somebody to vote one way or another for a judge. Well, that's why you see all of these signs on the side of the road when you're going through an election. And so that's quite often how people actually recognize the names of judges. They don't know anything about the actual judge himself or herself, but they've seen the name a number of times. So they figure, oh, that must be the person to vote for, which is kind of a sad reason to actually have somebody, become your judge. But quite often it's the only reason people actually recognize who the actual names are. So because they don't know who anybody is, they look for any kind of familiar names. The other way that people tend to become judges is people do straight ticket voting. So if you're Republican and you get a Republican ticket, you're going to vote for everybody that's a Republican. Or if you're Democrat, it'll be the opposite. You'll vote for everybody that's a Democrat. And so you may vote for a whole lot of people you know nothing about, but they just happen to be in a specific political party. The other factor that kind of gets judges elected is campaign contributions, which, if you think about it, that's where they can get their name out there so people can actually recognize who they are. So that kind of goes back to the familiar names problem, or the familiar name situation, to where we recognize a specific name because we've seen it somewhere before, or if that name is very similar to somebody who has had a prominent position in the state before, that can also get somebody elected. So how do we get rid of judges? Well, there's a number of different ways. Obviously, attrition, somebody passes away, after time, live out their time, and basically they can't run anymore because they're not alive anymore. That kind of sounds like a pretty stupid reason. But the other reason, and the other ways of actually removing a judge is we have state commissions. It's called the State Commission on Judicial Conduct. It's a 13-member panel. It kind of like looks at a judge to see if that judge has actually done something wrong. And so usually it's because something's been brought up during a trial or during a case, or even in the media, to where they're now challenging this particular individual. And so if these 13 people will meet and decide whether or not they should remove that particular judge. Also, the second way is, according to Article 15 of the Texas Constitution, you can have a judge removed. And the way to do that is you need a 2/3 vote in the legislature. And then the governor is actually allowed to remove that particular judge. Now, if there's another way also within that same constitutional framework, which is if they get 2/3 vote in the state Senate, then they're automatically removed. Basically, you don't need the governor for removing. It's just an automatic thing. So those are kind of the things on the background of our state justice system. least our court justice system in Texas. In the next chapter, we'll actually talk a lot more about the criminal justice system to kind of see how people get into the court justice system or the court system. But that's basically all you need to know kind of going forward. Again, more information in the book, and follow the information that's actually in the PowerPoints, and you get a good idea of kind of what we're talking about.